Now, the U.S. says Russia's military campaign in Syria has worsened the situation there. Washington accuses Moscow of seeking to bolster President Bashar al-Assad's government instead of targeting terror groups.
Moscow has cynically tried to claim that its strikes are focused on terrorists, but so far 85 to 90% of Syrian strikes have hit the moderate Syrian opposition, and they have killed civilians in the process. Despite our urging, Moscow has...
Patterson was addressing the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee. She said the Syrian army's offensive, backed by Russian airstrikes, has displaced at least 120,000 people. Russia has been pounding positions of Daesh terrorists and other terror groups in Syria for more than a month after a request by the Syrian government. Syrian forces backed by Russian warplanes have liberated a number of militant-held areas over the past few weeks. Well, to discuss that further, I joined Mr. Tony Gosling, who is an investigative journalist, and he's joining us live now via Skype from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, the Russians say they're making progress, and of course so do the Syrians, but America seems to be saying the opposite. How do you feel about that?
Well, that quote we just heard was priceless, wasn't it? The Russians are hitting the moderate opposition. Now, hang on, what kind of moderate opposition is it that takes up guns, that takes up rocket launchers, and that starts killing civilians, and then indeed conducting a guerrilla war where they're hiding in civilian areas so that the government is having to actually shoot very close to and sometimes at civilians in order to uproot them? I think that the language that's being used by the US State Department is becoming absurd, ridiculous, and that's one of the things that worries me about this, is that the absurdity means the Americans are kind of running out of ideas, running out of options, and of course these big superpowers are quite dangerous when they get to that stage. But I think, you know, John Kerry, he speak with forked tongue. That's what the Native Americans, I'm sure, will be saying about him, because Russia has been forced into Syria by the complete failure of the United States and its NATO allies to actually deal with Islamic State, which many people believe, including me, that they had a big hand in starting in the first place.
And of course, the declared mission of all of the above is the same, to defeat Daesh. So why aren't we seeing them working together?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think if the US, if NATO and the Western allies were serious about dispatching the Islamic State, they'd be working hand in glove with the Russians now in doing things like targeting information, that sort of thing. But in fact, on the ground, what's been happening is occasionally it's leaked out, because effectively Syria is a news black hole. We get very, very little information from what's really happening on the ground, is that US and British planes have been recorded and reported, certainly in the Iraqi press, as actually dropping supplies to the Islamic State. What they're trying to do is exactly what they've done in other states in that part of the world, which is actually a plan which was revealed by Wesley Clark, the US general, just after the September 11th attacks, that the American Pentagon wanted to destroy and take over 7 countries in 5 years. Well, they're well behind on the program, but that is exactly what they're up to. They're trying to destabilize the Middle East because they would rather disrupt a country and leave it destabilized than allow other powers such as the Russians or the Chinese to start moving in. We're moving towards a world war phase here, where the big powers are coming up against each other, and actually the smaller countries are finding it more and more difficult to stay independent. But I would point out that we have our Remembrance Sunday coming up this weekend here in Britain, which is where we remember the dead of 2 world wars, the First World War and the Second World War, we call Remembrance Day, where they sell poppies. But the poppy appeal has been actually taken over, would you believe, by the arms industry sponsoring these sorts of events. And the message of the Remembrance Day appeal, where everyone holds their hand on their heart and says, we will never forget, actually this phrase, never again, has been dropped from the Remembrance Day services here in Britain, because we're getting closer and closer to another world war. And I think maybe this weekend at the Remembrance Day services is a good time to start thinking about whether we really want to revert another world war.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that point. But of course, as always, we do sincerely appreciate your insight. That was Mr. Tony Gosling, who had been speaking to us live from Bristol.